Hi class, hope everyone's doing well. We're going to have a lecture today on what we call the Reagan-Clinton boom, or really the 1990s Clinton economy, which is really the main focus for today's lecture. We'll do other issues. We'll do a little bit of politics today, but we'll do mostly culture and more politics tomorrow. Today we're really going to just focus on what the economy was like in the 1990s. Right. So hopefully you already watched the two videos that I instructed you to on haiku. Right. There were these two. So if you didn't do this already, it's really in your best interest to do that. Watch the first 5 minutes of this video, then watch the last few minutes or so from 11:15, where he talks about the income groups. We'll actually come back to here. And these represent two very different case studies of how we can view the 1990s and really the American economy for the last 50 years at least, right? So we're going to just begin by looking at these two videos. Hopefully can generate some discussion. Let me know what you think in the discussion board that I created for today. Which view seems to be more pertinent? Maybe you found value in both of them, but one of them you favor towards the other. It's really just an opinion question, so it doesn't really make um, a difference either way. It's all about what you value. Do you value prosperity or do you value equality? And there's good arguments as usual on both sides for that. So today we're going to look at the Clinton economy and how it developed as it did, why it developed as it did, and what we can learn from it. So Clinton was a really successful president, presided over the United States for two terms. He won in 1992, and then he won again in 1996. It's a little bit bigger for us so we can see better. As you can see here, the incumbent president was George H.W. Bush. He was the vice president under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And Clinton was the governor of Arkansas. He was actually very little known when he ran for the Democratic Party. No one really gave the Democrats much of a chance to win this election, so it was a big upset that he won in the first place. The reason why the Democratic Party could win this is that this guy, Ross Perot, a billionaire from Texas who made his money in the oil markets, he ran on an independent ticket. He was basically what we call a libertarian. That's someone who is socially very liberal and economically very conservative. They value freedom above all. The freedom or the liberty. That's why we call them libertarians. To do kind of whatever you want as long as you're not hurting somebody else. So that means low taxes economically, low regulations, no problem with inequality. But socially, it also means equal rights for all groups. So you can see why some liberals would be attracted to this idea and why some conservatives would be attracted to this idea. Okay. So he actually won a pretty good percentage of the vote, right? 18.9% of the votes, an enormous number for a third party candidate. But he didn't win any electoral votes. And typically, libertarians pull more from the Republican Party than they do from the Democratic Party. So without Perot in this race, George H.W. Bush almost certainly would have won in 1992. But he didn't. And that's why we're learning about Bill Clinton and why we don't really learn too much about George H.W. Bush. Okay. So the Clinton years copied Reagan's fiscal responsibility, meaning trying to balance the budget, but Reagan, of course, wasn't able to do that. Clinton also talked about appealing to law and order. The crime rate, which will be the discussion of tomorrow's lecture, was absolutely through the roof. So more on that tomorrow. Um, Prioritizing individualism over collective behavior. So focus on group identity was not as important under Clinton as it would be under later presidents. And personal responsibility. The idea that if you get yourself into trouble, you can get yourself out. And the idea that you are your own biggest problem or largest barrier in life. Those were part of Clinton's campaign speeches. If you go back and you read his first inaugural address, these are the themes that you'll see in his speeches. And he was really just saying very much the same kind of things that Reagan was. So today there's stark differences between the Democratic and Republican parties. In the 1990s, there were differences. Of course, there were differences, but not nearly as stark as they are today. Moderate Democrats like Clinton could actually sit down and get along and have a lot in common with their Republican colleagues, and vice versa. The other thing that you need to think about when you think of the Clinton years is the dot-com boom. So the advent of the internet was probably the single most important reason for the booming economy during these years. Think about how many jobs exist today because of the internet, right? How many of you are going into or considering going into a field when you go to college that didn't even exist, 30 years ago? You know, the internet is just an incredibly um, um, uh, labor saving um, invention. It helped millions of Americans organize their materials. Think about how many secretaries, how many personal assistants, how many businesses rely on the internet today that they wouldn't have had 30 years ago. So the dot-com boom, the idea that the internet is creating tens of millions of new jobs. That's the main reason that the economy um, boomed, right? Because it's creating new jobs. Third thing that I want you to remember is the word triangulate. So Clinton came in to office and pushed a lot of very liberal policies early on that didn't sit well with the American people because they were too far left for the American populace to tolerate. And he got clobbered in the 1994 midterm. So he was elected in 1992, pushed more left leaning policies. 1994, the Republican Party capitalized on that and won enormous landslide victory in 1994. It was the first time that the Republican parties were the Republican Party was in charge of the House of Representatives in almost half a century. So it was a long time um, that the Republican Party could do this. And Clinton, because he was a very good and astute politician, he came up with this word. He said he was going to triangulate, meaning he was going to sit down with people like Newt Gingrich. He was the new Republican Speaker of the House, and negotiate with them and compromise and be a reasonable politician who was um, willing to give up a little bit of his principles in order to create good legislation that was capable of helping the American people. Newt Gingrich's contract with America um, was what allowed the United States to kind of get into that point in the first place. It basically said that the government was going to hold itself accountable, that government employees, politicians wouldn't have special rules that didn't, that exempted them from the laws that they were creating, that they wouldn't have sweetheart packages written into these laws, which was typical at this time. And it was very appealing to the American people. Clinton could have stuck his feet in the sand and said, "No, I'm not going to budge. I'm not going to work with these people. I'm not going to work with the Republicans. You're the opposition party." But he didn't. He sat down with them and he got two very important pieces of, well, one important piece of legislation and then one other very successful policy goal achieved. First is welfare reform. They changed the welfare laws so that you were not able to collect a welfare check unless you could demonstrate that you were actively looking for work, right? It's called the work requirement of the Welfare Reform Act of 1995 or 1994. I think it's 1995. And then the other part was that even if you were collecting welfare, you couldn't collect it in perpetuity. You couldn't just collect welfare forever. You got kicked off of welfare at some point. Um, the idea behind this is not to punish people who are out of work, it's to give them more of an incentive, right? So the analogy would be something like, imagine I gave you an indefinite timeline to do your homework assignment, right? Many of you might put it off until the last possible minute, until like the last marking period or something. that wouldn't be good for your development. So by giving you deadlines, we're kind of holding you accountable. Welfare reform is trying to do the same thing with people. It's giving them more of an incentive to actively search for jobs. Second thing he did was he balanced the budget, and we'll actually come back to this by the end of the lecture today. He's the first president in oh gosh, I guess 150 years to actually balance the budget. The last time that the United States budget was balanced was under Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and the 1830s. So it had been a long time since the government was not spending more money than it was taking in. And that's what we mean by a balanced budget. It means that the money that the government collects in taxes, it was actually collecting more in taxes than it was spending. Right? Every other year in American history, the last 150 years, the government was spending more money than not. And this is the reason why we have this enormous debt today. And we had a pretty big debt back then, but it looks like a tiny little nothing compared to today. So all these are pretty successful changes in the Clinton administration. And now we're going to kind of dive into um, the economy a little bit more. Right. So here are the budget deficits under Clinton that I mentioned before. Right. So the deficit means how much money the government owes at the end of the year after you add up all of its receipts and subtract all of its spending. And as you can see, throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s, like this was increasing. Right? We were spending more money than we were collecting. Under Nixon, under Ford, under Reagan, under Carter, it really accelerated under Reagan because of, remember some last time, should be defense spending, right? That's the reason why it goes up so much. And then George H.W. Bush increased as well here. And then as you see what happened with Clinton, look at that. I mean, every single year it's going down for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 straight years until finally we're in the green, until finally we're actually taking in more money than we're spending. And we can only do this because the economy is booming. So there's a larger taxable base to bring in. More people have jobs, more people are making more money. So when you get a raise, if you have $100,000 a year income and you get a raise of 10% as opposed to 5%, that's an extra $5,000 that the government is taxing you on, which means the government has more money. So it's in the government's best interest if the American people are making more money. And during these years, because of the dot-com boom in the 1990s, as well as other things that we'll talk about in a moment, that we had more and more money, right? So that we were taking in over $200 billion more by the year 2000 than we were actually spending, right? So the main point here is that Clinton's economy was so great in part because of the internet boom and in part because he kept the very low tax free market economic policies in place. Right, there was pressure on him from the left of his party to drastically increase taxes. Say, listen, the rich are making more money than they've ever made before. Let's tax them at higher rates. But Clinton said, no, let's find a way around this. He did raise what we call capital gains taxes. I'm sorry, he did raise income taxes just a few percentage points. I think it went from something like 35% to 39%, so just 4 percentage points, not a huge change. But he also lowered capital gains taxes, which means if you have money invested in the stock market or in real estate, you're actually paying a much lower tax overall. So Clinton, in general, while he raised some taxes, he lowered many others, and in general, he was keeping the low tax policies of the Reagan administration, which is in stark contrast to all the presidents before that. Remember, Eisenhower, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, everyone before Reagan, they were operating under a very high tax economy where the wealthiest people in the country were at least subject to rates. They weren't paying these actual numbers, but the rates were upwards of 90% of their income was being taken away. So that all got slashed under President Reagan, which we talked about last time. and Clinton is essentially keeping those policies in place. So the consequences to that look like this, right? So if you look, I'll give you a moment to just look at this chart. Okay, so you can see how, actually, you can see now, this goes back to 1820, right? You can see how rapidly the global poverty rate um, it was reducing, not just during this period, but look how sharp the curve gets right here after World War II, 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, right? Really coming down, really, really coming down. Part of that is because of the low taxation policies here in the United States, but that, of course, doesn't really affect what's happening in the other 95% of the world. So Clinton wanted to share the American wealth with other countries and bring up those countries so that the rest of the world could catch up to the American standard of living. So under the United Nations and other organizations created what we now refer to as globalization, meaning an interconnected global economy that has capitalism, free markets as its basis. This helped out poor countries, as you can see, helped them get out of poverty, but it also created more inequality at home. I have a chart to show you that on the next slide. The organizations that might show up on a College Board test that you would need to identify with this concept of globalization are the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Those three organizations are going to provide loans to businesses in developing nations. By developing nations, we mean countries like India, China, Brazil, that are largely poverty stricken, but have the demographic base to really get their economies started and to lift people out of poverty. China had begun that after they abandoned communism, once they opened up their markets under Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s and early 80s, such that each month in China, I mean, it's just an unbelievable statistic. Each month in China, 1 million people were lifted out of poverty. 1 million people every month were lifted out of poverty in that country alone because of the free market doing what it does. It 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 gives people incentives and it allows people to pull themselves out and each other out of poverty. Okay, here at home, we have had a policy called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association. And this is more controversial today than it was back then. Uh, this was a policy that was designed to um, increase the number of jobs that are being exchanged between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, right? North American Free Trade. Uh, so the idea here is to lift up Mexicans out of poverty by having them manufacture things that were manufactured here in the United States, and then have Americans purchase those manufactured products, which will then boost the American economy. So in other words, if if I purchase a tie that's made in Mexico, the wage labor paid to that Mexican worker might be something like $2 an hour, as compared to someone in the United States who's working in a manufacturing plant where that wage is going to be probably close to $10 an hour. So the price of that tie is going to be driven down because the business owner is saving $8 for every hour that that worker is working. So instead of charging $40 for that tie, they might be able to charge $35 for that tie. And that might be the difference between a lot of people purchasing the tie or not purchasing the tie. So in other words, you're giving a very poor person in Mexico a job, which is a good thing. You're taking away a job from an American who would be doing that, which is from an American perspective a bad thing. But you're also saving $5 for every American who purchases that tie, which collectively, the argument goes, will save more for the economy long term than just the one job for the one person. So NAFTA, here I have a great chart to show you this. NAFTA is seen as a success by free marketers because it's pulling the very poorest people in developing countries, third world countries, out of poverty. That's why most of the stuff um, um, that we use is not manufactured in the United States anymore. But on the other hand, it's also going to hurt some American jobs. So if you're working in a tire factory in the Midwest, you probably don't like NAFTA very much because your job was pushed out of the United States and now someone else is doing your job for you. So if you look at this chart, right, going back here, this chart looks like all these policies are really, really great, right? People are getting out of poverty, and that's wonderful. That's fantastic. And that is fantastic. However, the argument against this is that if you look at the total income growth by percentile, so here's poor people who are in the lowest 10%, here's rich people who are in the top 10%, and then here's the people who are like very, very tip top. This is world, by the way, not American. So basically everyone who lives in Bergen County is somewhere in here, right? You can actually do this on your own, by the way. I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent, but I thought this would be fun. You can kind of follow along with me. Let's do median income US 2019, 63,000. Okay, let's do median income Bergen County, New Jersey. 100,000. Okay. So if you go to this website, globalrichlist.com, you can type in your income. This is a little bit deceiving because if you click on the fine print down here, this is after tax and all that. So if you make, say, $100,000 a year, that's actually before taxes. After taxes, you're probably bringing in something like 60 or 65. We'll call it $65,000 here. Right? And you want to see where you fall under the global rich list scale. So what percentage are you in according to this chart? Are you in the 70th percentile, 80th percentile? You go to show my results. And it turns out if you make a median household income of about, for Bergen County of about $100,000, which after taxes is about $65,000, you're actually in the top 0.15% of all of the richest people in the world, right? And then they have all these fun little organizers and graphics, give you an idea of how much money you make in an hour, right? And how long it would take someone in Ghana in order to make that much money. 406 years. We don't have time to sit through 406 years. You can kind of play around with this website if you're interested in seeing that. I thought that would be fun for you guys. So the point that I'm making here is that the middle class in America, they are actually getting quote unquote squeezed, right? So see this, right? These are the people that are getting squeezed. So globalization, this is going to help out the poorest of the poor. They're going to be increasing their income growth by 100%. That means they're doubling their income. That's like a really good thing over the course of 36 years. That's really great. But some people are going to get ahead at faster rates than others. So the poorest of the poor are doing very well. But America's middle class, which is right here in this 90 to 99 percentile right here, right, they're not going to be experiencing the economic growth as much as the top 0.001% of people or the 0.01% of people in the world. And remember, us living in Bergen County, we're in that 0.15%. So we're somewhere in this vicinity right here. Right, we're experiencing about double growth from one generation to the next over the course of about 36 years, which is about your working career. You'll each work about 35, 40 years during your careers. So the point here is that some Americans and some people in the world are getting ahead at faster rates than others. And a lot of people don't like this. This creates what we call inequality, right? There's the major theme um, of what's happening. And there's other charts that can show the same thing. It's called the elephant curve, if you're interested in this. Elephant curve, inequality. Images, right? Kind of looks like an elephant, right? Because it's going up. Right? Economic growth rate is really good for the poor people, and then it actually comes down for Americans. Now, again, America's lower middle class is in this 80 to 90 percentile rank, right? And then it's going to go up again for the very, very wealthiest people. Let me actually click on this and see if we can go to that. There we go, right? You guys can see the tusk and the trunk right here. Right? So it's going to come down here. This is the group that's most concerned about what's happening with globalization. The people down here who are not experiencing much growth at all. The key here is that the chart can be a little bit deceiving. Just because you're down here doesn't mean you're not experiencing any growth. You're still experiencing growth. You're still making more money year in and year out. You're just not making as much money as the other groups are. Right? So again, going back to the chart, they're showing all of these groups are showing growth. Right? If you were under here, below this line, then you could make an argument that, well, listen, I'm actually making less money as a result. Everybody's making more money. Right? It's just a myth that the poor get poorer under a capitalist system. That literally never happens. There's no example of that over the long term outside of something like a short-term recession. Where that actually happens. It's just a phrase that people use to emphasize this trend, which is real, where some people, the very, very richest, are getting ahead at faster rates. However, if you look at this, I mean, the one group of people who's actually getting ahead at the fastest rate isn't the richest of the richest of the rich. It's actually the middle class over here, people in that 50 to 60 percentile who are experiencing really serious growth during the time period that we're interested in. Okay, so this is a chart kind of showing what we showed before as well. This actually has more up-to-date data than this one did over here. This uses different organizations. The trend is pretty clear, right? Percentage of people living in extreme poverty, which means you're making less than $2 a day, right? Which is pretty bad, like really bad. Right? That number used to be, when I was born in the 1980s, close to 40%, right? All the way down to today, we're at something like 7%. Right? And again, this is something that you can probably Google. And you can probably look at different sources to give you that number. Okay. 1.1 billion people living in extreme poverty in 1990. 2015, it was 736 million. Right? So all of that is because of globalization. The main point that we're trying to make here. Right? And Clinton was presiding over those kind of policies. The stock market under President Clinton absolutely went nuts. Right? Enormous growth in the stock market. Right? So when he came into office right here, compared to when he left office, it was a little bit of a recession just as he was leaving office. But still, even with the recession in mind over here, right, you're talking about earning almost 9 times your income. Right? So you're doubling your income nearly every year under President Clinton. Right? Critics argue that this created, again, too much inequality. Because if I have if I have, let's say I have $1,000 in the stock market, and I make a 5% earnings versus my rich brother-in-law who has $10,000 in the stock market and he makes a 5% earning, who's going to do better? Right? He's going to make a lot more money than I am because he's putting in more money in the first place. That's going to create more inequality between my brother-in-law and I. But that doesn't mean that I'm getting poorer. So the critics argue that the inequality itself is a problem. People who are more free market oriented argue it doesn't matter how much money some other rich guy has. The question is, are you getting better? Is your life improving? And this again brings us back to the beginning of the lecture today, where we looked at that video, where you were, those two videos. So which perspective is more important to you? That really depends on your own value system, right? But the question here is about inequality. Inequality is a major theme in the 1980s and 1990s, and today for that matter. Last thing we'll do today, I thought this would be a fun activity to look at the income quartiles of different countries. I'm gonna hide this. Wait a second, I lost it. There it goes. Right? The income quartiles of the different countries, right? So this is the poorest group of each country, the lower middle class, middle of the middle class, and this is the upper middle class. Then here's the rich, people who are in the top 1% of income earners. If you look at this, and you kind of had a dartboard and you weren't sure what country you were going to be in, which country would you most want to land in? And I'll give you guys a second to think about that. You can kind of pause the video because I'll just go right into the reasons why you should come up with the proper country. So the question of inequality is important here because the United States clearly has the most inequality, right? If you look at the poorest Americans versus the richest Americans, look at that gap from here all the way down to here, right? So the richest Americans make almost $450,000 a year. These numbers are a little bit outdated. The census is coming out later this year, so I can actually update it to 2020, but the general trend is the same, right? So they're making about $450,000 a year, whereas the poorest Americans are making, let's see, I actually have the data here, are making $31,000 a year. People in Denmark, the richest of the rich in Denmark, are making about what does that look like? About $160,000 a year, whereas the poorest in Denmark are making, again, about a little under $30,000 a year. So which country would you want to be in? The answer should be the United States, because even though we have the most inequality, even our poorest of the poor are making more than their poorest of the poor, whether you're in Canada or Denmark. So in other words, while yes, we have more inequality, even our poor are doing better than those in Canada and Denmark, right? And I just kind of use them as two very good first world countries that anyone would be lucky to live in. So, but this is the problem. When there's some Americans that are making this, and there's some Americans that are so far ahead, a lot of Americans see that inequality in and of itself as a problem. And this is the criticism of the Clinton economy. It's really the only criticism of the Clinton economy, because everybody is pulling themselves up. The median income, the average household income, the wages, everything is coming up during this time period. Everybody's getting out of poverty. Everybody's entering the middle class. And as you saw with that second video about that by that economist whose name is escaping me, yes, the middle class is disappearing, but it's disappearing because it's becoming rich, right? Our middle class is becoming an upper middle class, and our upper middle class is becoming wealthy. Right? And again, that's not true for everybody. That's not true in every individual case. There are still people who, through either bad choices or bad luck, have been able to get ahead. But if you're looking at the aggregate data, if you're looking at it from a sociological and historical perspective, the 1990s economy has been really, really good. Despite the criticisms of the inequality, which can create all kinds of social problems because it creates resentment, and people don't feel good about themselves, and creates psychological problems. So this inequality does create actual problems that are non-economic. Um, but from an economic perspective, there's no question that the green country, whatever it would be the country that everyone should want to live in, because you have a better chance of doing well compared to these other groups. Okay. So in sum, the 1990s economy under President Clinton extended the boom from Reagan during the 1980s. He kept taxes very low. Economic growth continued because of globalization, because of the dot-com boom, because politicians were willing to work with one another back then, Democrats and Republicans alike. But the downside to that is the increased inequality that we just talked about. Trade deals like NAFTA push these manufacturing jobs in the United States and Europe into developing nations like China. On the one hand, that's really great because you're helping out poor people who need the jobs the most. On the other hand, that's a very tough pill to swallow. If you're, someone who's working in the middle of the country, maybe you're in Detroit, maybe you're in Appalachia, maybe you're in LA, and you work in a manufacturing sector. You never went to college, you're not going anytime soon, and you learned a skill, and then that skill or that trade was 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 offshored to another country, and now your job is gone and it's not coming back. If you're in that position, if you're one of those Americans, and there's millions of those Americans, they're a small percentage of the overall population, but there's millions of them. NAFTA is seen as a real serious problem in the 1990s and early 2000s. All right, so we're going to stop right there. That's the end of the lecture today. We'll do Clinton and culture tomorrow, and as usual, um, under the attendance, write down any questions that you might have from today's lecture. All right, and just keep on keeping on, because I know this isn't easy for any of us. All right, guys, thanks so much.